Our speaker for tonight is a renowned military historian, former classics professor, and a commentator on modern warfare and politics for several prestigious media outlets, including the National Review and the Washington Times. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and his doctorate, both in classics, from Stanford University. He's a senior fellow in residence in classics and military history at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University, and he's been a visiting professor here at Hillsdale College since 2004, where he teaches an intense 3-week course each fall. In 2001, he published his best-known work, Carnage and Culture: Landmark Battles and the Rise to Western Power, which became a New York Times bestseller. In 2007, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President George W. Bush. When he isn't teaching, writing bestsellers, and receiving awards, he enjoys time on the family farm in Selma, California, which has been the Hanson home for several generations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you very much. This is my 13th year that I've visited Hillsdale to teach. It's been 14 years since your president, Larry Arnn, came to my farm, called me up and said, I'd like to talk to you about coming to Hillsdale. And I said, where is it? And he said, Michigan. I knew where it was, but I acted as if I didn't. And I said, God, I can't go to Michigan. And he said, when I'm done with breakfast, you'll be coming to Hillsdale. And he was right. So I'd like to talk for about 35 minutes about World War II. That's what we call it. In Britain, it's known as the Second World War. And then I'd like to entertain questions. I have a book that's coming out from Basic Books called The Second World Wars, plural, because this idea of a holistic single war was a very late concept, not until about 1941, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I was always confused as a little boy growing up in the late 1950s and early 1960s. We would go to these family dinners on the farm, and I had one uncle who fought in the Aleutians, and he'd say he fought the Japanese, and it was cold, and he tended plane tenders. I had a first cousin who fought in Iran, and his job was to be at Basra and convey Dodge trucks to the Russians to fight Army Group South on the Eastern Front in 1942 and 3. I had a father who was the loudest of everybody, who flew 39 missions in a B-29. He would talk about his brother Victor Hanson, who I was named after, who was killed on Sugarloaf Hill on the last day, 6th Marine Division in 1945. I had another first cousin who would come to these things, and he said he rolled with Patton. I said, what does roll with Patton mean? He fought in the 3rd Army as well. And I'd always, when it was all over, I'd say to my dad, these guys, you didn't fight in the same war. I remember that conversation, so it was the impetus for this book. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, some guys fought the Italians, and some guys fought the Germans, and some guys fought the Japanese. And I mean, I was only about 12. I didn't know what I was talking about, but I had a good instinct in that sense. I said, they fought from the Aleutian Islands in the Japanese theater, the Pacific, all the way down to New Guinea, and from the middle of China all the way to Hawaii, and in the European front, from the Volga River all the way out to off the coast. They sank submarines 3 miles off the coast of Miami, and from Norway in the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert. And then as I got older, that kept reverberating in my mind, and I thought, what do they have in common? I know that the fascists at least could make the argument that Italian fascism and Japanese militarism and National Socialism in Germany were alike, but what did we, the Allies, the 3 major belligerents? I mean, the British were a parliamentary democracy, but they did want to hold the empire. There was no person who wanted to get rid of it more than Franklin Roosevelt. We were very anti-British in that sense. And of course, we allied with Joseph Stalin, who had killed more people than anybody alive at that time. And the answer, of course, is they had only one thing in common, the Allies. They all had either been surprise attacked by an Axis power, or in the case of Britain, their ally had been attacked. That was all they had in common at that point. That was the basis of the Allies, that they said that we don't have to be perfect, we just have to be good, because these people have attacked us our interest. And that was the basis for this idea of a Second World War as a unique whole. If you think about it, it really matters because there's a lot of things I'm going to try to get in the next 30 minutes. But one thing is there had never been an event like it before. 60 to 65 million people died. That figure at the end of World War II was 40 million. It keeps going up every year as research comes in, mostly from two fronts. The Chinese front, where the total is now up to 17 million people, and of course the Eastern Front, 27 million people. So in other words, it was much more lethal than the Great Plague of the 14th century, the Black Death. It was more lethal than any tornado, earthquake in the history of the human experience. Of all the wars that have happened in the last 300 years, together, the death toll did not match World War II. There's been nothing like it. 27,000 people died per day for 6 years. Why we've been in Hillsdale today, more people died in the same commiserate 3.5 hours than died in Iraq in the late Iraq War. It was that lethal. A couple of other things that are just mind-boggling. It's the only war, major war, in which more civilians were killed. 80% of the 65 million were civilians. It's the only war where the losers killed 75% of the people. The losers did. The winners, Japan killed 7 times more people than they lost. And they lost. So there's things that are bizarre about it. And how do we explain this? It's inexplicable. Why was it so lethal? A couple of things jump out at us. It was the first war when we had 2 billion people on the planet. More people died because there were more people alive. We've never had a mechanized war with that many people alive. It was the first truly global war. We call it World War I, but it didn't go down to Africa. The Graf Spree was not, in World War II was sunk in Buenos Aires. That nothing like that was comparable in World War I. There was not a Pacific theater in World War I. This was a total global war all over the globe. And it unfortunately occurred at a period of Western technological excellence, the zenith of Western technology. So there was the internal combustion engine had reached the pinnacle of efficiency. 500, 400-mile planes, ships, people could travel very quickly and reach these places. There were instantaneous communications. That added to the death toll. There had never been weapons like this before in any war. This was a Western versus a Western war. It was not a Western versus a non-Western. It wasn't the British fighting the Zulus, where it was very quick and lethal because they had the technology and the others didn't. It was not a non-Western, the Aztecs fighting the Toltecs. It was a Western powers turning that tradition on each other at a time when they had reached the pinnacle of their excellence. So there had never been anything in the world like napalm. There had never been anything like the plutonium and uranium bombs. There had never been anything like a V-2 rocket. There had never been anything like a B-29. So technology accounts for a lot of it, as does the sheer numbers of people alive. The war was long. There had been longer wars, 30 years war, 100 years war, but not recently in the modern industrial age. The Civil War was 4 years roughly, World War I was 4 years. This war was 6 years long. That explains some of it. In every technological cycle, there's peaks and valleys between offensive weapons and defensive weapons. In the ancient world, Greek armor was protective, so it was not able to be penetrated, and casualties were only 10% of battles. Until the age of gunpowder, a city could resist a catapult. At other times, even with the introduction of gunpowder, the arquebus was so slow firing that it was hard to kill a lot of people. Today, we're back into a defensive cycle. There are things in Kevlar helmets and ceramic plates that protect. I went to Iraq twice during the surge, and I remember going to the operation headquarters, and there was a wall with people's body armor where they were shattered with AK-47 bullets, and a little sign, "This person got no wounds." That was inconceivable in World War II. Machine guns today, Marine, are not that much different than World War II, but defensive armor exists in a way it did not in World War II. There was also, and I think this is very important, there were ideologies that had never quite existed before. Most of the wars of the past in Europe and Asia were fought over territory or religion or race or ethnicity, but never quite ideology. There were new ideologies of the 20th century that were secular, agnostic, atheistic, mostly National Socialism, Italian fascism, and Soviet communism. And they were a mishmash of bastardized views of everybody from Wagner to Nietzsche to Darwin to the progressive idea of eugenics and natural selection and sterilization. But they all had one thing in common. They introduced to the equation a relativism about good and bad. They were relative movements. So if you wanted to kill 6 million Jews, you could find a exegesis to support that without having to be condemned by religion. There was the idea of survival of the fittest, or there was the idea of a national destiny, or an idea in Russia of radical equality is worth it. But in all of these ideologies, the so-called exalted ends justified any means necessary. We put all of that together and we end up with this stew that nobody ever dealt with, and explains for a large part this horrific tally. Now, the word World War II in America in the Second World War was a very late word, not really employed until about 1941. If people look back at World War I in September when Germany invaded Poland, they still knew it as the Great War. For about a year and a half, there was no indication that this war would become what it was, a global bloodbath. Germany invaded Poland with the Soviet Union. 30 days, 28 days, the war was over. Germany invaded the next spring. Denmark, 1 day. Norway, about 6 weeks. In April, it was over. Germany invaded the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France. Nobody could believe that would be possible. They had not been able to do it in World War I. They'd only gone 70 miles. This time they took the entire Western democracies, all that area, in 7 weeks. Battle of Britain, the first time they had been stopped, but not their army, only their navy and their air force, and they took the Balkans, as you remember, in April of 1941 in Greece and Crete. And all of that period, Germany only lost 100,000 soldiers. The war was over. Hitler had achieved what nobody else in history had done, not Napoleon, not Caesar. He had basically combined what is now the European Union. Any country that opposed him were pro-Nazi anyway. Switzerland, the Iberians in Portugal and Spain, my ancestors in Sweden were not only selling him iron ore, but doing it with free transit and credit. Turkey was pro-Nazi at this time. He'd achieve it, the war was over. There was a problem in Britain only because there was this problem called Winston Churchill. Halifax would have cut a deal, the former King Edward would have cut. There was one man who had come to be prime minister the day of the invasion. He would not yield, but that was the only, we were isolationist and the Soviet Union were collaboration. Here's what's, I think, a very valuable lesson. How did that happen? It had not happened in 1870-71. It had not happened 1914 to 1918. How, in less than 2 years, did the whole infrastructure of Europe crumble? I know some of us think, well, they were Nazis. They had Panzers. They had BF-109s, and the answer is no. It was a weird combination of British and French appeasement, Russian collaboration, and American isolationism. I'd like very quickly to run through what I mean by that. When Hitler turned to the West after conquering Poland and building an alliance with Bulgaria and Romania and Hungary and having the help of the Soviet Union on his rear, his generals came to him in OKH and OKW, you can't go into France. We did that one time. We only got 70 miles. We lost 1.1 million people. And Churchill had said the hope of the West is the French army. We think today that the Panzers were indestructible. The German army was 3 million people. France had 3 million people. The combined arms of the Netherlands and Belgium, was almost another 500,000. The British Expeditionary Army was going to have 300,000. The Allies had almost 4 million soldiers. They had 3,000 tanks. The Char B tank, to take one example, had a 75 millimeter gun, superior to anything in the German arsenal, Mark I, Mark II, or Mark III. The Mark I's that went into Poland didn't even have a main gun on them. The Germans were quite surprised that the submarine Spitfire, in most characteristic, was comparable to the Bf-109, and French Douane fighters were superior. What I'm getting at is, materially, it shouldn't have happened. It should have been a deadlock. Even though they had the Maginot Line, they knew they could not go through it. They had to go through the Ardennes. So what happened? And it's a lesson for the time, and that is they lost deterrence. It's comparable to this last 6 months in the United States, that all of a sudden Putin is buzzing all of, you notice that, all of our aircraft? All of a sudden the Iranians are trying to cause a incident with our ships. All of a sudden people in South Sudan shoot at an American diplomatic car. All of a sudden North Korea is sending these things, and it can't be true because we have overwhelming military power. And the answer is military power is important up to a point, but you have to have deterrence and not deference. And to get back, what I'm getting at is, if a man from Mars looked at the comparable military strength in Europe at that time, they would have said Hitler would be insane, as he was told by General Halder. You're insane to even think of it. General Beck resigned over it. You cannot do this. And he said, I've seen them at Munich and they're worms. That's the term he used. The more you tried to be affable to Hitler, as Chamberlain did, he said, Hermann Goering said, well, Chamberlain was very nice to him. He said, if I see that old man again, I'm going to jump on his umbrella. And he brought out a trait in human nature that the more you try to defer to someone when you have power that you did not need to defer, the more you earn contempt for your magnanimity rather than appreciation. In 1928 in France, it was against the law to put in a school book any mention of the triumph at Verdun. In Holland in 1930, a destroyer was renamed to a flotilla leader because they thought that the word destroyer was too provocative. In 1933, the Oxford Debating Society, in a very famous debate, said, for king and country I shall not fight. At the same time, they were already trying to violate the tenets of the Versailles Treaty in Germany. Mussolini was already planning to go into Ethiopia. The Japanese had been fighting for 2 years. So there was a sense of appeasement, which is a good word at that time, that you were ready to listen. Soft power, lead from behind, that's what it was. But it meant that they sacrificed their material advantages because the people in it were not willing to fight. In other words, they lost deterrence because they were not willing to lose a few thousand soldiers so they wouldn't lose 60 million people in a war. And that translated on the battlefield as a Bf-109 was no better than a French fighter. A Mark III tank was no better or worse than a Char tank, but 5 missions for Bf-109 per day, 2 for a French fighter. French tanks ran out of gas, Germans did not. French got to the Moose River to defend it. They asked where the bridging equipment was. They waited a day and a half. Rommel swam across the river. That was the difference. There was another ingredient that made the inexplicable not just possible, but certain, and that was American isolationism. Now, we had a fight over the Versailles Treaty. Today, we often think the Versailles Treaty was too punitive. The Americans didn't want any part of the League of Nations. They said, you know, we brought 2 million people over there. We saved them at the last moment, and we don't get involved. All they had to do, the United States, is say, forget the League of Nations. Multi-power never works. We just have an alliance with the French and the British, that if they are invaded, we will send 2 million people, as we did in the war. We got 1 million over there in 6 months. Had we done that after the invasion of Poland and had 1 million soldiers been there, they probably would have had a deterrent, and Hitler would not have gone into Western Europe. We didn't do that because we felt that the Versailles Treaty had been unfair. There were people who were saying World War I, now that I think about it, was the cause of arms merchants, automatic alliances that caused automatic mobilizations, greedy capitalists, everything but German imperial aggression. Believe me, the Versailles Treaty compared to what we did to Germany after World War II was a piece of cake. Nothing in the Versailles Treaty said we're going to go into Germany, occupy it, cut it in fours, and have troops there for 50 years. Does anybody here in Germany say, we have to go to war again because you were mean to us for 1945? And the answer is we did the two stupid things that you do in the history of war is you are punitive and you're weak. We humiliated Germany in the war clause, and then we were not willing to occupy the country and stand with a gun to their head and say, you're going to have a Weimar Republic, and we're going to watch it day by day by day. And so if you compare the Versailles Treaty, if we had just looked at what the September program, that's the idea of what Germany would have done had they won in World War I, annex all of Belgium, all the French ports, get rid of Luxembourg. It's pretty punitive what they did to Russia in 1918 at Brest-Litovsk. They annexed 50 million people. We forget today that in World War I, they were only 80 miles outside St. Petersburg, the German army. They took a million square miles of Tsarist Russia. It was the most punitive peace, and nobody said that's too mean. So 1871, they took all the Alsace-Lorraine. So we were wedded to the wrong exegesis of what had happened. We wanted no part of it. And that empowered Hitler. There was a final and probably the most important catalyst for this unnecessary war that turned border skirmishes into World War II, and that was the Soviet Union was not just appeasing and isolation, it was collaborationist. On August 23rd of 1939, they signed a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler. And they ended up providing Hitler with 30% of his oil, 30% of his wheat, almost 20% of precious metals, chromium and tungsten and things like that. At one point later on when Stalin, of course, as he always did, berated Churchill for not opening a second front, Churchill turned to him and said, well, wait a minute, the Junkers and the Dorners bombers that were killing British people in September of 1940 were fueled by your oil wells in the Caucasus. We forget something about Stalin. Of the 6 major belligerents in World War II, on the Axis side, Italy, Japan, and Germany, and the United States, Russia, and Britain, Stalin cut a deal with every one of them at one time or another. And he honored the ones with the Axis better than he did us. He never broke the non-aggression pact with Germany, and by affiliation with Italy, he signed one with the Japanese in April of 1941, right before the invasion by the Germans. And it was so effective that you could take a Liberty ship from Portland or Seattle, full of aluminum, take it all the way to Vladivostok, the Pacific port of the Soviet Union, and the Japanese would get away and not touch it because they didn't want to violate that non-aggression, even though they were killing us in places like Taro and Iwo Jima. That collaboration, which didn't do him any good, did it? That collaboration allowed Hitler to turn westward. And he said later in table talk, I would have never done that had I not had a secure flank. So you think of this. Isolationism, appeasement, and collaboration did something that shouldn't have happened. It turned a border war in 1941 into a global conflagration because of 3 events, all explicable by these 3 motives. Number 1, nobody thought that Hitler would be so stupid to invade the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in the period from August 23rd, 1939 to the period when Hitler stabbed and Stalin in the back and invaded Russia, gave more precious metals and resources to the Third Reich each month than they got an entire year by looting the Soviet Union. It was the stupidest thing in the world. The Third Reich had 80 million people. The Soviet Union had 180 million. And yet they almost, as you know, pulled it off. That would not have happened had these other events not occurred first. That meant that all of a sudden a dormant border war, there had been no fighting since Crete in April, turned into a new world war. Suddenly the front went from Crete and Athens very quickly to Rostov outside of St. Petersburg. And if you can believe, I don't know if we should believe the soldiers of Army Group Center, but they said on December 5th they saw the spires of the Kremlin. The front had turned into a continental war between Asia and Europe. That was not just a world war yet. 2 other events that nobody had decided occurred on December 7th when the Japanese surprise us, attacked us in the Marianas, the Philippines, Wake Island, of course, Pearl Harbor, and then the British in Malaya, Burma, and most tragically, Singapore. Why did that happen? Because as General Yamamoto, we all think he was such a wonderful man, I can raise hell for 6 months. No, he said, I will resign if you don't let me do Pearl Harbor. We all said, well, Admiral Yamamoto would like Foreign Minister Masuka and General Yamaguchi. They'd all been in the United States in the 20s. They respected us. They understood how nice we were. No, they had contempt for us. They said so in their memoirs. Yamamoto said, I've seen these people. They have nice cars and they wear spats. He was right. And he thought that he would give us a terrible slap on the face and we would say, please, we will do it. And why did he think that? Because he said, and the Japanese foreign minister said, any country that won't come to the aid of Britain while it's burning down surely won't care about a few battleships and carriers at Pearl Harbor. We had the second largest navy in the world. We all think the Japanese Navy had 11 carriers, most carriers in the world, but in tonnage and types of ships and quality, the United States had a superior navy. And as they were bombing Pearl Harbor, we had 27 carriers on order that were built within 2 years. We built 151 light escort and fleet carriers. It was insane to do that. Why did they do it? Same reason that Hitler went into the Soviet Union, because they didn't think that the dangers outweighed the possible glory and material benefit. And they had good reason because of appeasement, isolationism, and collaboration. And then finally, the third unfortunate event that turned a border war in Europe into a global Holocaust. I don't know why it happened. We can argue about this. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on us. Think of that. And why did they do it? Hitler gave 50 different reasons depending on what day of the week you happen to transcribe his rants at night, 2 in the morning. Sometimes he said, I wanted to help our U-boat commanders who were sick and tired of seeing American ships go right out in Miami with a silhouette in the city and they couldn't touch them. And they did sink 14 million tons of Anglo-American shipping by the time of the war. Sometimes he said, I went to war because I owed it to the Japanese. And as General Warlimont says, you didn't owe them anything. You double-crossed them with a non-aggression pact when they were fighting Zhukov in 1939, and they did it to us. That's what we do. We're Axis. Sometimes he said that the Americans will have a two-front war. I'm brilliant. I've never had a two-front war. And they said, you have a two-front war. You've got Britain now and America, and you've got, oh, no, the Americans are cowboys. It'll take them 5 years to get here. Who knows what the reason was, and even less so Mussolini. But those three events, the invasion of Soviet Union in June, Pearl Harbor, and the declaration by the Germans, followed by our own counter-declaration later in the day, meant that now the war was, as I said, global, and it was pretty inevitable that it was going to be a lethal war like no other. And there was a simple calculus that sums up the war, and we'll get to the end of it, and that is, could the Axis powers who had been fighting in Spain, in China, in the Anschluss, bullying Czechoslovakia, and had rearmed much earlier, could they defeat the Allied powers before they rearmed? If they couldn't, they were going to lose. They had 200 million people. Soviet Union, United States, and Great Britain had 400 million. They had tanks. Britain produced more tanks in World War II than did Germany. Soviet Union produced 70,000. We produced 55,000. Germany only produced 20,000. There were 600,000 airframes produced in World War II. 600,000. We produced 400,000 of them. Germans never built a four-engine bomber. They couldn't do it. Japanese couldn't do it. The Italians couldn't do it. The Americans and the British produced 40,000 of them. So that was going to be inevitable. By 1945, in September, the United States gross domestic product was larger than Germany's, Japan's, what was left of Italy's, Britain's, and the Soviet Union put together. There was no way they were going to win that war if we mobilized, we being the Allies. So they had to win it very quickly. They thought they almost did it. They almost did it by, I think the high water mark would be sometime in July of 1942. Army Group Center was about 100 miles from the Caspian Sea in Grozny. They just about had their grip on all of the oil of the Soviet Union. German soldiers had climbed the Caucasus and put a swastika on Mount Everest. The front was 1,500 miles long. Moscow was still besieged, so was St. Petersburg. The Japanese had lost a total of 3,000 soldiers only. They had had a setback at Midway, but they had most of the greater Asia prosperity sphere under their control. They were going into Guadalcanal to cut the supply lines to Australia, and in North Africa, Rommel was 60 miles from Alexandria. And then suddenly there was something called Guadalcanal, 1st U.S. Marine Division, Stalingrad, and El Alamein, and the whole thing vanished, and then the war was essentially over in the sense it was just a question of how many million people are going to be necessary to lose their lives to insist on unconditional surrender rather than an armistice. So we get to the question, why did the Allies win so easily? And I mentioned that the war was the story of the people who killed the most. The nations that killed the most people lost to the nations that built the most stuff. They killed 80% of all the 60 million, and we built over 80% of the munitions. And in war, unfortunately, munitions can be more important than lives. But there were a few other reasons. Number one, we had a more appealing message to third powers like India not to revolt, or the Indonesian people to not cooperate in Switzerland to give back pilots. And the message was, we didn't start this. They attacked us, and we had something called the Atlantic Charter, the Four Freedoms, the Casablanca Conference. It was very hard to do because we were working with Stalin, who was a mass murderer, but the appeal, at least, the propaganda was, we are not taking anybody's land. The United States didn't take anybody's land. We don't want anything other than to beat the Axis. That was much more appealing than the Yamato race, the Raza race in Italy, and the Volk in Germany deserve this because they are superior Übermenschen to you people. That helped a great deal. Second thing that helped is you don't have to be democratic to win a war, but it's good to have some democratic allies because their leaders don't lie as much. So what do I mean by that? Every time that Hitler talked to the Japanese, he lied. Don't believe me, Count Ciano, the son-in-law of Mussolini, said, we saw Hitler today, and he lied. He said he wasn't going into the Soviet Union. We know he is next week. So we're going to lie back to him and go into the Balkans again. And Count Ciano then says the next day, well, we can't get too mad at him that he invaded Russia because we invaded Greece and didn't tell him. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Hitler said, where's Pearl Harbor? 1939, the Japanese are in the middle of a fight on the Mongolian border, and Foreign Minister Matsuoka says that we're part of an Axis, the Pact of Steel, the Anti-Comintern Pact. Hitler just signed a deal with the Soviets. Hitler's ready to go in to the Soviet Union. He's planning in March. He talks to the toady, General Keitel, and says, do you think there's any chance that the Japanese will invade from the east? He says, not now. They just signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. He said, that's terrible. He said, yeah, they did what we did to them. So there was no trust when people are not democratic. Stalin was a liar, but he had two democratic leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, that honored their word, and he did business with them. And he was more or less, until the end of the war, pretty dependable that he would do things that he said he would do. In other words, he didn't sign a separate peace with the Germans. We didn't sign a separate peace. That was very important. A couple of other things. We had cooperation. They didn't. What do I mean by that? Mussolini invaded everybody with almost nothing. He invaded the Balkans. He invaded Greece. He invaded Somaliland. He invaded Libya. And he never told Hitler. There was no cooperation. Hitler said, oh my God, he's gone into Yugoslavia. I got to go into Russia in 2 months. Why did he do that? I've got to go down there. And he delayed, supposedly he delayed Operation Barbarossa by 30 days. We sat down with our partners, we being the Allies, and said, the Russians are going to fight on one front and one front only. They're not going to have strategic bombing. They're not going to have four-engine bombers. They're not going to fight in Italy. They're not going to have a U-boat war. They're not going to be in the Pacific. All we want from them is to kill German soldiers. And they killed 75% of all the Wehrmacht soldiers in the war. Almost 5 million of them. They broke the back. And they did it because they moved their factories to the Urals. They had great munitions, but we gave them 2,000 locomotives, 375 Dodge trucks, so much so that Goering said these are automatic robots. He used the word robot. Automatons, he said, because these damn Americans have motorized their divisions, and 70% of our divisions are driven by horses. And Goering said, they have an oil war, we have a grass war. We have to find grass, all they have to get is oil. And they have it, and we don't have grass. So we divided up the labor. We said to the Russians, we'll go to Italy, we'll go to Sicily, and we'll go to the Pacific. And with the British, we said to them, in the Pacific, we're not going to get along here as well as we did in Europe. You have colonial interests, we understand that. You want to protect India. You want to get back Burma. You're worried about Malaya. We just want to, we're not a colonial power. We were attacked, and we're closer to the Japanese. We just want to go straight to Japan. So we'll do our thing and you do our thing, and maybe we'll meet in 1944 or something. And it worked out. There was a division of labor. It was more than just that, though. For the first year of the U-boat war, German torpedoes bounced off like ours did. They were no good. At the same time they were bouncing off, Japan had the greatest torpedo in the world. Oxygenated long tom, best torpedo, 40-mile range, and they didn't even know it, the Germans did. Japanese needed a fuel-injected, supercharged aircraft engine. Germany had a good one. They didn't even know it. There was no cross-fertilization between the axes because they didn't trust each other, as you would imagine. We take the Sherman tank. We find out it doesn't work very well against these new Panthers. The British say, don't worry, we have a 17-pounder. We'll put it in the turret. They gave us 2,000 Fireflies. They could blow a Tiger out at 1 mile, and they were much cheaper than building a new tank. We had a great plane, the P-51, and we didn't quite match the Focke-Wulf 190. The British said, don't worry, we'll drop a Rolls-Merlin engine in it, and suddenly it was the best fighter of the war. That was constant. And finally, there was one other thing, getting to the end. When you go to war, you have to have some conception of how to destroy the enemy's ability to fight, because most enemies will not have an armistice. Sometimes they do in World War I. We had an idea. What do I mean by that? The Americans said, as soon as after Pearl Harbor, we have a way, we have 4-engine bombers, we have 2 on the drawing boards, we're going to bomb their capitals into smithereens, and we're going to land, we have the Navy to do it. Britain says, we have a Navy, and we're going to help you, we have a 4-engine bomber. And the Russians said, we don't need those, we're on land, but we will be in Berlin. Germany, Hermann Goering, of all people, said to Hitler, Mein Führer, how are we going to get to New York? You declared war on it. And he says, we're going to have an America bomber. He says, we don't even have any bomber. How are we going to get there? Admiral Yamamoto was asked, when are you going to bomb San Diego? When are you going to bomb Portland? He said, I'm never going to bomb Portland. Well, what's going to stop Detroit and all these places from making weapons? They had no idea. So they started a war with powers they had no ability to reach their homeland, and they lost, unsurprisingly. If we look back at the war, who was the big winners and losers? Biggest winner and the biggest loser was the Soviet Union. They lost 27 million men, partly because of the stupidity of Joseph Stalin, partly because they took on the Wehrmacht, partly because they had collaborated and they were surprised. That being said, for such a duplicitous power, as I said, cut a deal with everybody, when the war was over, the Soviet Union, even though they had that lost 50 million people who had been occupied, 27 million dead, for the first time in their history, they were in the most advantageous strategic position imaginable. All of Eastern Europe was now communist. The Baltic states were back inside the Soviet Union, so was the Crimea, Ukraine. And as one Soviet diplomat laughed in Britain, you guys went to war to stop totalitarianism in Eastern Europe by Hitler, and you've insured it by us. And it was sort of true, wasn't it? George Patton said that. Britain waged a brilliant war. It was the only country to fight the first day of the war and the last day of the war, September 1st to September 2nd. 6 years. No other country fought the entire war. No other country went to war, think of this, for the principle of an ally. We only went to war when they attacked us. Soviet Union only went to war when they attacked us. Germany attacked people. Italy attacked people. Japan, not Britain. They went for a war for principle. They were brilliantly led. They put 40% of their investment in land, in air and naval power. They avoided the Somme, the Verdun. They lost the fewest of all the major, 425, less than half what they had lost in World War I, and they fought a much more ambitious war in II. That being said, they mobilized, we think we mobilized, they mobilized to a degree that was unprecedented, more so in terms of per capita investment than the United States or Soviet Union, and they were flat broke when the war was over. And then unfortunately, because of the deprivation, they began to socialize their rails, their healthcare system, their transportation, their iron, their steel industries, their power, and lo and behold, within 10 years, the countries that were flattened, like Japan and Germany, were industrial powerhouses, turning out Mercedes and Hondas and Toyotas, and Britain's car industry, to take one example, was over with. So they had a very tragic, and they also gave up their empire, willingly so, but theirs was a tragic experience. And it makes me very mad when I hear Obama saying they're going to get back at the Q. They were the most admirable and idealistic of all the allies, and they fought way above what people thought they were capable. In every single category of munitions, except 1 year of planes, they outproduced the Third Reich that had all of occupied the EU of today under its power. Not much to say about the Italians. They quit in '43, and so after the war was over, we said, well, they weren't really involved in the Holocaust. People fought 2 years in Italy with the Civil War. Germans fought Italians. We fought them. Let them go. They're Italians. Vatican, etc. So they didn't end up suffering. Japan was strange because, as I said, they were the most vicious. They killed 17 million people in China, and yet they lost 3 million, quite a lot. We burned down 40% of their urban through the B-29 incendiary raids, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but we never invaded their land as we had done Italy and Germany, so they had not seen a battle on their own turf. I know they'd been bombed, but when they unilaterally then surrendered, they never quite accepted that the American Marines or Army could get face-to-face with them, and they never came to deal with their past as they do today. And if you don't believe me, they just put their first big carrier, did you see it? They just launched it. You know what the name of it was? The Kaga. You know what the Kaga was? It was the leading carrier at Pearl Harbor. Finally, we come to the United States, and it's, if you look at what our aims and objectives were, we achieved all of them. We wanted to not just defeat Germany and Japan and Italy. We had done that in terms of Austria, Hungary, and Germany in World War I, and we said never again are we going to have to come back here. We're going to have an unconditional surrender, even though it's going to cost us several 100,000 lives. And we occupied their country, all three of them, and we've had peace. We don't have any problem. And then we discovered something. We lost 425,000 people, only 3% of our military. Only Britain lost less, and we lost a smaller percentage. We had the second largest military, 12 million people, larger than Germany's, only the Soviet Union, slightly bigger. As I said, you've seen Willow run here, a B-29, a B-24 every hour. We had the largest GDP, every category. It's just stunning to think what we did in a major 3 years. And yet, when the war was over, we had this dilemma that the bad guys, the fascists, the Nazis, the war people, the people who started the war were ours. We had to rebuild them. We had to go to the Japanese and say to the Chinese, I know they killed 17 million, but we're going to make them democracy, and they're going to be your friend from now on. Then we had to go to the French, and we had to go to the Poles. The Poles lost 3.5 million and say, they're not that bad now, they're good Germans, and they're going to build democracy. And then we had to go the same thing to the Ethiopians and the Libyans, say the Italians didn't mean it, now they're good. That's a hard thing to do. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is telling all of the world, China, Burma, the war never ended. We're still liberating people from fascists. Only the difference is now the Americans, the British, especially the Americans, have joined the fascists. To conclude, what do we make sense of this? How did it all start? I think one of the things to remember about World War II, as in every war, but especially World War II, is to get a general view of what war is. War is a laboratory, a barometer, a thermometer. It's a measuring device. That's all it is. It's a very bitter one. So two sides have differences, and nobody knows who's stronger and who's weaker because there's material consideration, tanks, planes, and there's willpower. If you have Churchill on your side, he's worth 20 divisions, but they didn't have him, of course. They had the tradition of Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain. But the point is, war then tells you in a very, very difficult way who is stronger after all. But it doesn't need to occur if you can convey that message before the war breaks out. So we went to World War II to prove a banality, that nobody in his right mind ever thought that Italy, Germany, and Japan could ever fight the combined power of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. It was physically impossible. But it took a war to prove it was, 65 million, because of American isolationism, British appeasement, and Russian collaboration. Thank you very much.